Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an airline pilot, and in today's video we are going to cover the avionics setup of the Avro RJ series. Let's go ahead and take a seat and we will start to work on our setup. This includes both the FMS setup as well as our thrust rating and takeoff performance, and last but not least the MCP. We're going to start down here on the FMS though. So we've already clicked ourselves into the FMS and entered the IRS position during the alignment process. Now, on the start of the actual FMS setup, we should still go over the ident page once again. Now, if you've clicked yourself into a different page, you can always get back to it by clicking the init ref button, index, ident. Over here we check that we've got the correct aircraft version, engines, and most importantly that our navigation database is up to date. When that is done, we can click onto position init, where we can enter the IRS position if that has not previously been done. Now, if the IRS has not finished the alignment process yet, then you can copy the last position up here and paste that down into the actual IRS position. Next up, we continue to the route page, and over here we are going to enter our entire flight plan. Now, the aircraft does have company route functionality, however, for the sake of completeness, let's do it manually. So we're departing Zurich, which is Lima, Sierra, Zulu, Hotel. And our destination is going to Hamburg, Echo, Delta, Delta, Hotel. Our flight number is actually the call sign, so don't confuse the two. If we have a look at our OFP, we can see that our flight number would be LX1054. However, the call sign is Swiss 105 Zulu. Be sure that you enter the call sign, as this is what's forwarded to air traffic control. So over here we've got Sierra Whiskey Romeo 105 Zulu. Next we select our takeoff runway, and we do that over the departure arrival key. Then we can press departure, and we are going to take off on runway 28 today. Our departure will be the Degas 3 Whiskey departure, and when all of that is selected, you can select the transition as applicable. Let's continue back to the route page, and now we can see that we're departing runway 28 via the Degas 3 Whiskey departure to the waypoint Degas. Now below here we can now enter our route. So next up we fly via Zulu 1 towards Etago. So let's enter Zulu 1 and Etago. So the airway always goes to the left and the waypoint to the right. Next up, we're going to press the next page key in order to go forward to the next page. So next is going to be direct Harem, direct Lore, and direct Elnat. Since no airways are required, we can just enter them directly. So Harem, Elnat, and Lore. And here we go. So, Harem, Lore, Elnat. As you can see, we have done a small mistake over here by entering Elnat in front of Lore. Now, how can we correct such a mistake? There are several ways. The most obvious one would be to click delete and then try to remove something, but you will see that that actually does not work in this aircraft. So the correct way to do this is just to take a waypoint from somewhere down low and paste it to the top. So for example, we need Lore in front of Elnat, so I can copy Lore up here and just include it at the top, and that removes anything that was in between. So now we've got Harem, Lore, and we can enter Elnat back in, and that way you can correct any mistakes that you might have done during your route entry. Okay, next we fly via the airway Papa 605 towards the waypoint Nolgo. So let's enter Papa 605. So that's P605. And we follow this one until Nolgo. Okay, so last but not least we are going to enter our landing runway, so we press departures arrival again, Hamburg arrivals, It's an ILS approach to runway 15, and we are going to follow the Nolgo to Delta arrival and the Delta Hotel 457 transition. Now let's go back to route and let's quickly review what we have just entered. So over here we check that our entire route is in here, no discontinuities, and that our correct procedures have been selected. Once we're happy with that, hit activate and execute the change. You will see that an automatic message telling you to enter the performance init data comes up. Let's clear that message and then let's press the performance init key so that we can continue with our setup. Now for the performance init we need our flight plan. We start with our reserve fuels, and the reserves are always the alternate plus the final reserves. So in our case 1.1 plus 0.9 makes 2.0. So let's go down here and enter 2 for our reserves. The zero fuel weight can be taken directly from the aircraft page down here for our zero fuel weight once our boarding is completed. If the boarding is not completed yet, you can use the weights from the flight plan, but then you have to update them later on. So zero fuel weight today, 35.9. Alright, the cruising altitude comes once again from our flight plan. And it is flight level 280. And then we need the cruise wind and the either ISR deviation or top of climb. Now, temperature. Now, depending on what your flight plan offers, you may not have them immediately available. In case of the flight plan layout that I'm using over here, which is the Lufthansa layout, we don't get that data. So we can cheat a little bit and take it down here from our top of climb, where you can see we've got the wind 212 at 12 and the temperature minus 36. If you have a better source for that data, if your flight plan gives you this data in a better format, then you can of course go ahead and use that. Last but not least, we enter the transition altitude, and do note that this is not automatically pulled from the database in the RJ. You need to enter that manually. So we already pre-selected our charts in the first video in this series. If you haven't watched that yet, I very much recommend you to do it now. So we've got the Degas 3 Whiskey chart, and the transition altitude is 7,000 as we can see. So we can go ahead and enter 7,000 down here in the transition altitude. When you're done, press execute, and that concludes the most important data. However, there is a little bit of optional data that you can enter as well, and that is starting on the fix page. Over here it is good practice to enter your departure airport and draw a 25-mile ring. You do that by hitting /25 and then include it down here on the radial distance line, and this now draws a 25-mile ring around our airport. This is good practice because the MSAs given on charts are always within 25 miles around the fix in question. So today we've got the airport as fix, and then 25 miles is our MSA down here. What we can also do is to draw those radials here, 040 and 100, in order to mark the section in which the MSA is 4,500. To do this, we can enter 100, this time without a slash, put that down here on the radial, and then 040. One small note though, depending on the charts that you are using, they either give you the bearings or the radials. This chart over here gives us the bearings. Remember, a bearing is a track towards the station, a radial is something outbound from the station. Since we want to draw our line down here, we gotta convert the bearings into radials, which is simply adding 180 degrees or subtracting 180 degrees. So 040 becomes 220, 100 becomes 280. So let's correct this mistake. 220, 280. And if we now have a look at our nav display, you can see that the green lines over here now represent our MSA sectors, and if we zoom out a bit, you can see the 25-mile ring around here as well, which gives us a little bit improved situational awareness for our departure. Last but not least, The FMS has a VNAV menu. However, the aircraft itself does not have VNAV. But on here you can enter, for example, your speed schedules, speed restrictions, etc., which then can be used in flight as a reminder. So for example, today we are going to use a speed schedule of 280.66, or we can adjust this. Now, Swiss in the real world use 260/Mach 0.67. So let's go ahead and enter this and execute that change. If we press the next button, we get up to our cruise page where we get the maximum flight level depending on the current entered conditions, and on the descent page you can also enter descent forecast information already. But remember, this is purely advisory. There is no actual VNAV on this aircraft. Alright, when the FMS setup is completed, then we are going to select the VNAV page on the pilot flying side and the legs page on the pilot monitoring side. And that concludes our FMS entries. Now, just make sure that you don't accidentally put anything into your scratch pad. Now, if you want to be complete, then you are now going to go ahead and check all those waypoints and make sure that the waypoints on your chart agree with all the waypoints and restrictions that you have in your FMS. That is something that you should do in the real world, but I know that many flight simulators can't be bothered with it. But just to mention it at this point. So now we've completed our FMS setup, so let's continue on the rest of our avionics. We are going to next move up to the mode control panel. On this one there's a couple things to do. Let's start with some basic switching. We need to turn on our radios and our flight directors. So this is the first thing you can do. Radios on, flight directors on. When you turn on the flight directors, be sure that you turn the side of the pilot flying on first. So if you're flying from the captain's seat, turn the left one on first, which brings the master light onto the left side. The master light determines which radio and which FMS is going to be used by the autopilot. You will see the same on the autopilot engage buttons, where you've got nav 1 set to the left one and nav 2 to the right one. Now, in our case, we are flying from the captain's seat, so the master has to be on the left hand side. Next we can go ahead and set up the radios. So, for our SID today, we can see that we are initially proceeding straight ahead to 2.3 DME from Cloten VOR, which is on a frequency of 114.85. So let's go to the radio and dial in 114.85 into the radio and switch it active. Now, we can do the same on the other side as well, 1485 and active. Apart from that, if you look at the chart over here, we don't really need any other VOR for this departure. For this reason, we're going to use Cloten on both sides. Next, let's think about the courses. So, of course, we are going to fly initially on the runway track to 2.3 DME. Thereafter, however, our chart wants us to make a left turn to intercept the 252 track in Mount Zulu Hotel 552. Now for this, we can go ahead and tune the course on the left side towards 252. Last but not least, after we are doing the turn, we need to fly on track 051 back inbound to Cloten VOR. So let's select 051 on the right hand course. This way, if you have any problems with your navigation or with your FMS, you can always revert back to flying the SID raw data. Now, let's continue with our actual MCP itself. The first thing we need is our runway heading. So, looking at the airport chart, we can see the runway heading right down here. For runway 28, that's 273 degrees. So let's go back up here and set the heading back towards 273. Here we go. Finally, we also need our altitude, which we can find on the departure chart. Down here, initial climb clearance, altitude 5000. So let's go over here and set 5000 on the MCP. Now, a lot of operators will ask the pilots to set the altitude plus or minus 100 feet until ATC clearance has been received. So for example, you could set 4900 or 5100, until ATC has actually given you the IFR clearance. This serves as an indication and as a reminder to you as pilot that you have not actually been cleared to this altitude just yet. Today we assume that IFR clearance has been given already, so let's set 5000 into the MCP. Now when this is finished, we need to think about our radio setup. So, do we need anything on the ADFs? Not today, since our SID doesn't use it. Since we don't need the NDBs, we can set the RMI to VOR instead of ADF. So we can use the VOR on both. Do note that this is your primary DME source over here. So do check that you actually get a DME indication. If you, for example, forget to turn on the radio itself, then you will see that you also will not receive any DME. So this is quite a useful thing for you to do and to check. Last but not least, we get down to our nav display setup, where we have to select an appropriate setting. Now, if we are flying based on the FMS, we can simply use the map and be sure that LNAV is selected. If you use a different source, you can select, for example, Warlock, or you can select the course up here. But today, we will be using LNAV, as that is how we are going to navigate. Last but not least, you can use the data button to cycle between different pieces of information. So you can see when it's off, you don't see anything in the bottom right of the ND. When you press it for the first time, you get your ground speed. For the second time, you get the wind. And for the third time, you get the distance to the next waypoint. So I would personally recommend to use the ground speed over here, since that will be most useful for our flight. Likewise, I am a great fan of selecting airports or nav aids or just anything that does make sense for the flight. Now this would complete our FMS setup and our avionics setup until the boarding is completed and the load sheet is received. Once the load sheet is received, we can continue with our setup by determining our takeoff data, and we do that through the thrust rating computer over here and that little speed card that you have over here. Now the speed card is automatically going to update itself. In our case, we have 42 tons of takeoff weight, so let's go ahead and set this up. First things first, we need to determine the flex temperature. To do that and to enter it, we are going to first of all select the correct mode. So you have max toga, which is full thrust, or if you click the button you get reduced toga, which is basically a flex takeoff. Next we take the outer knob and rotate it to the temperature selector. And now we can insert our flex temperature up here. Now, unfortunately, JustFlight does not provide us with any flex temperature calculator at this time. For this reason, we need to help ourselves. So here's a good rule of thumb. In the real aircraft, they normally used rather high flex temperatures. 50 is the maximum, 50. And as long as you have a runway that's 2.5 kilometers or longer, you can actually use that. Our runway is that long today, so let's dial it all the way up to 50. If you have shorter runways, something around 30 for a runway that's between, say, 1,800 to 2,000 and a bit meters, 40 if you have between 2,000 and 2,500, 50 over 2,500, and of course all of those should take your obstacle clearance for the takeoff into consideration as well. So if you're taking off, for example, with some high altitude constraints shortly after your liftoff, then you should probably consider going full toga, as the RJs just don't climb that well. For a reference to that, see my video on the flight from Milan Linate to London City, which is where I went through these procedures. Now, when the flex temperature has been decided, we can move on to the V1. V1 normally equals V rotate, unless you've got a wet runway. In that case, you can subtract 5 knots from your V1. Today, we are going to use 136, so let's dial in V1 136. Next, we rotate the selector to the V cross position, and V cross equals your rotation speed, and that's likewise 136 today. And here we go. Last but not least, we're going to rotate it to the last section, which is your V dot, and the dot equals VFTO, so 186. Now, what is VFTO? Well, VFTO is the minimum clean speed at which your aircraft can safely fly at this weight. So you can kinda imagine FTO as well as flaps takeoff. If you do a takeoff with flaps 18, which is the normal takeoff flap setting used under most circumstances, then at 186 during the acceleration we can retract our flaps. Last but not least, we have to set our V2 140 knots, and we are going to set this up here on the MCP. If you're a cheater, you simply click onto here and then it is automatically going to select all those values for you. Which is the reason why you see 140 already up here. Last but not least, we rotate the selector back to the N1 setting so that we have easy and quick reference to the N1. I know it's written up here as well, but this is small, this is big, and just like most women, I'm more a fan of the big thing. Okay. So that concludes our avionics setup. I do hope that you found this one interesting and that you have learned something today. Thank you very much for watching. As always, be sure to leave your like and comment underneath the video, subscribe to the channel if you're up for more, and if you really love what I'm doing, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below. Thank you very much for watching, and I'm looking forward to see you all again on the next one.